Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Writers' Right podcast. We're going to be calling this Writers' Talk, where writers talk about writers and writing. I'm Christopher Dean from Writers' Right, and my co-host today is...
Oliver Fox. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Oliver. Today is our first episode, and we'll be talking about Neil Gaiman, a well-known British author and showrunner who is famous for writing Sandman, American Gods, Caroline, as well as co-writing Good Omens with the late Terry Pratchett. So, Oliver, where should we begin?
Let's begin with a little bit about his, who he is, where he's from, his literary influences. I think that'd be a good idea to kind of get a sense of who he is as a person, so that we can understand better how that is borne out in his writing.
Excellent. I think that's a great place to sort of touch off. So what do we know about Neil Gaiman? Obviously, he's British. I think born and bred Londoner is the impression I get from him. Although I'm not sure if he was born there. Is that?
No, I believe he was born in Hampshire. But his family is Eastern European Jewish origins. His grandfather was from Antwerp, Belgium.
Okay.
So that's, yeah.
Right. So you were telling me something off the recording just a bit earlier. You said he grew up as a Scientologist?
Yes. So his parents apparently they were very fascinated by Dianetics, which was a central concept of, as a sort of a object of study within Scientology. It's a concept that L. Ron Hubbard came up with when he was first kind of kicking it around, wrote a book on Dianetics. I'm not going to pretend like I fully understand it. I'm sure it is, it's a whole subject in and of itself.
I'm sure a nice man will come to your house if you're interested in the subject and tell you more.
Yeah.
So just Google that if you really want to know.
There you go. Yeah. No, I actually do have from way back, I don't know where it is, but I do have a Scientologist tract that was really fascinating. Anyhow, so he grew up in a Scientologist household. But there was definitely, from what I've read of him, Judaism was just sort of a cultural thing in his household. It was something that he still was aware of and impacted him. But it makes more sense now why, if you look at L. Ron Hubbard's volumes, his recent editions of Battlefield Earth, the person on the cover is Neil Gaiman talking about it.
I had never thought of that.
Yeah.
Makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, so that kind of just clicked into place for me.
Not to say, I suppose, anything negative about Neil Gaiman in that regard. I don't think he's still a practicing Scientologist.
No, he's not.
And there's nothing about him that suggests any strange behavior in that regard. So it is just an interesting point in his background that might explain his general unorthodox nature regarding religion and such things.
Yeah, I think that so he describes himself as a Jewish Scientologist, and at the same time he says that's kind of a joke, that he doesn't practice Judaism, nor is he a Scientologist, but those are so foundational and integral in shaping who he is and, how he views the world, that it just makes sense to him to call himself a Jewish Scientologist.
And certainly if you look at his work, there's an interest in religion throughout most of it.
Oh, absolutely.
He's recently published a book on Norse mythology.
Mm-hmm.
And his approach to that is very interesting and quite entertaining, I think, in regards to how he describes the myths.
What is it in particular to you that you found fascinating about the way he approaches that?
Well, I suppose in that regard, it came out as a set. There's the publishers, I can't remember. I think it might have been Penguin. I'm not entirely sure. Don't quote me on that. He published Norse mythology with at the same time as Stephen Fry was writing about Greek mythology.
Oh
And
yes,
he published a book called, I think, Mythos was the title.
Yeah, yeah.
And they were both just stories retold by each author.
Right. Exactly.
And so Stephen Fry rewrote all the Greek myths in his sort of style, I suppose. And then Neil Gaiman did a similar thing with Norse mythology. Yeah. And I just thought the difference between the two books was very pronounced. And I'd say Neil Gaiman's was much more entertaining than Stephen Fry's, just because he has a nice quality, a nice tone about the way he describes things, and it's sort of like a fireside chat about religion rather than someone stating facts or giving you an account of history or something like that. Yeah. So it's nice to, especially I listened to about half of it on an audiobook, and it was just, and he was reading, and it was very, very apparent that it was designed to be spoken almost, and which is very, very reflective of, like, I suppose, Norse mythology as well. It's an oral tradition at this point, or it was, I suppose. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that does go to, that makes sense with what I've learned about his kind of approach, his philosophy of writing and of storytelling. I just recently completed his masterclass, and one of the things that he, I don't want to say hammers or bangs on about or anything like that, because that would make it sound like it was obnoxious, but one of the things that he circles back to often is this idea of storytelling as a part of a shamanic tradition. And I don't think he's trying to be pretentious there. I don't think he's...
no, I think that is generally something he believes.
Yeah, I don't...
Reflected in many of his works.
Yeah, I don't think he's trying to act like, oh, I go into this trance and, I get inspiration from the gods or what have you, the muses, and they speak through me. I'm their mouthpiece. I think it's more akin to the idea of... people gathering around a campfire to share stories about life and living, about not just surviving, but thriving in the world. Because he does talk about how he thinks that all great stories should be able to be spoken. It should be, and that sounds silly, but if you think about it, there are some literary styles that are so ornate, so baroque, that to try and read it aloud feels very clumsy. It's almost unwieldy. So he is very focused on that oral tradition, making it something, and even something to the point where he said, stories start with children. We start by telling, bedtime stories or stories around the campfire. And so a great story should be something that, if as long as you keep the R-rated material out of it, the contents of the story should be something that a child could read and understand. So I think
he's very particular about that point. He even says that most adults have forgotten how to be a child, and so when they write about it from a sort of perspective of trauma or something disdainful, and he's all about trying to remember the good parts of being a child. That's how he tries to come across when he writes from a child's perspective, which is No,
go ahead.
Well, I just think if you think about some of his more popular works, like Caroline, or how do you say Coraline, I think is correct, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And his sort of autobiographical piece,
Ocean at the End of the Lane.
Ocean at the End of the Lane, yes. All Graveyard Book as well. And if you look with at Good Omens from the child characters in that, you get this sort of
Right.
sense of actual childhood, how children would have thought about things and reacted to things, which is
Yeah.
very interesting and compelling in that regard.
I think I think he has a purpose behind that. I think it's because, I mean, for me, childhood was when magic was real, you know? So it's not that much of a stretch to write about magical happenings if you're doing it through a childlike perspective. They have that natural sense of childlike wonder. So because the world is new, they don't understand the mechanisms behind things. You know, well, that's essentially all magic is it's anything that we can't explain or identify the mechanism by which something is accomplished. And so he has, by writing from these childish perspectives, by writing with this sense of childlike wonder, he's able to almost sell that magic a little bit more, even though these are, you know, oftentimes fairly ordinary places and circumstances overall in which these magical things happen in his stories. To these
So
rather.
why don't we talk about a few of those examples then?
Okay.
I think for me, if we're talking about magic, you have to talk about Stardust as one of the main ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
I suppose American Gods has a bit of that as well.
It does.
And what other? I suppose Sandman in his comic book series is very much about the sort of background magic of the world.
Yeah.
Although it's
the Graveyard Book. I think it just essentially it will play varying degrees of importance. You know, how far it is in the foreground or the background, but it's always there. I can't think of a work by him that is where
completely
magic is
without it. Yeah, it's hard to think of anything he's written that isn't magical. Certainly nothing that I've read by him doesn't have any magic in it at all.
Yeah. So Stardust, you were saying.
Yes, yeah. Stardust, I think, is the most maybe the most famous. Well, I don't know if it's the most famous example, but it was a big movie, 10 years ago or so.
Yeah.
And it's a fairy tale. It's a very short book. I think it's maybe 200 pages long, if that.
Yeah.
And it's just about sort of Celtic magic in the English countryside.
Right.
And this little town called Wall, which has a wall, and on the other side of the wall is the fairy kingdoms. And anything magical or mystical can walk through there at any time. But apparently that only happens once every so many years. I can't remember exactly how often it was. And it's about this boy who gets caught up in that world and has a sort of grand adventure. And I think in the style of Princess Bride, I would say. It's the most,
I can see that.
Something that stands out to me. But what did you think about Stardust?
So Stardust is, I mean, all of his books are fascinating, but Stardust is fascinating with the way that it begins. He does, so that's the story where he uses his, you know, you were talking before we began we started rolling, I guess. You mentioned you wanted to get into the, you know, his voice in particular, because you said you feel like that's the thing that stands out about him most. And I think that the reason Stardust is such an archetypal story for him, it is sort of the exemplar for his style generally, is because that's where he leans into the fairy tale voice the hardest, the most prominently. And essentially the way that he accomplishes that is, and this is something that I've observed just by, you know, analyzing it myself, but also listening to him talking about it. And he talks about how he essentially just assumed the classic storyteller narrator attitude and voice. So this is something probably my first introduction to it was The Hobbit. We have J.R.R. Tolkien is assuming, the role of the storyteller, and he's talking to you, the reader, and about we in our world and hobbits in theirs.
I was just thinking about that when you were talking earlier about books that can be read out loud, and The Hobbit's a very good example of that. Also, The Lord of the Rings is a good example of a book that cannot be read out loud. It's quite ironic.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that is the difference, is the primary difference between those two books is the voice, is the narrator. The narrator in The Hobbit is sort of a grandfatherly figure who's talking to you in a very informal way, whereas the narrator of the Lord of the Rings series is almost
sort of a Nordic skald writing an epic,
Yeah, it's like an epic. I was thinking something like from the Torah or the Talmud. It's this very grand.
That's
epic.
probably more accurate. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and it's fascinating the way it almost has a chant-like quality to it. Where they'll talk about, and then they came to a glade and they saw the forest, and in the forest they saw a tree, and they came upon the tree, and the tree had leaves it's this very...
These are the 5 ancestors of the tree and its history.
Yeah. Exactly. So the reason, circling back to Gaiman, he even talks about how for him, he assumed a persona for the writing of Stardust. And he said he actually thinks it's a woman. It was a woman storyteller who's sharing this fairy tale with loved ones. So the fact that he, even as he was writing, oriented himself in the mind of a storyteller and a very specific storyteller, that helps orient us as readers in a very specific place and time. We can almost imagine where we are when this story is being told.
That's very interesting that he picked a character when he was writing his book. I can think of a few other interesting examples though. There was Heinlein, the science fiction writer, when he wrote "The Moon is a Harsh Mistress." It's not meant to be a serious or a funny book, but he wrote it sort of in a Russian accent.
Oh, really?
for large parts of it, so it gives you a very very strange impression when you
That's
read
fascinating.
it. But also about that, a lot of people when they read, they don't have any sort of idea of narration in their head.
Yeah.
You apparently have 2 types of readers. Ones who just look at the words and the sentence sort of resolves in their head, and they don't have any impression of a narrator or voice in their head. And then you have a reader who has a particular narrator that sort of reads the words off the page to them.
Absolutely.
And so it seems that Neil Gaiman is really going for that second audience.
Absolutely. I think you're right on there. And I think that so the way that impacts Stardust is like you said, it is a fairy tale. It's about this classic, romantic world. In fairy tales, the world of fairy is always in the woods. It's beyond the walls of civilization. That goes back to, the Fairy Queen, which is a huge, very odd fairy tale because it's an epic. I think it's Edmund Spenser. But yeah,
it was that 15th century sort of works post like the actual authentic period where that sort of story would have been real. But it's in the sort of style of an old Celtic myth, I suppose.
Yeah, it had moved from folklore to a fairy tale. There's sort of a transitional period, I feel like.
It's sort of also around the time where the Arthurian myth was being codified into the more modern way we interpret it. And that is in a sort of fan fiction kind of style, where a lot of elements were just being incorporated that people liked from other myths into.
Yes. I love that.
I think Stardust reflects that as well, where you have various modern implementations of fairy ideas,
Yes,
which
absolutely.
sometimes go back to older ideas, where fairies are not good. They're mean or mean-spirited or neutral at best, and they don't particularly care about how they come across to mortals.
No.
So they might, in old myths, sort of steal away a child and just raise them for 50 years, grow tired of them, and throw them back to the human world, completely incapable of fending for themselves. That's the sort of idea I think Neil Gaiman's coming along with his idea of the fairy world.
Yeah, he absolutely adores fairy tales, folklore, and mythology, and he really does like to find a way to get back to those traditional interpretations of fairies, or I mean, essentially, what they were originally called was just the fair folk, and he likes getting back to that traditional because it has been lost. You know, Disney has tricked us into thinking that fairies are these sweet little winged
Tinkerbell, like pixie dust,
yeah,
and magic wands.
When the reality is, so I've been studying this a little bit recently, and essentially fairies as they were traditionally understood, it was essentially Christianity moving into the Celtic world and the Scandinavian and Nordic world. They had to find a way to take those native gods and demigods and mythic creatures and orient them so they didn't want to throw them out altogether, because they knew that the people they were trying to convert would essentially reject it. They said, well, this is something we've always had, so you can't just say it's no longer a thing. And I don't think they were doing this at a conscious level. I think this was just something that was happening. But essentially, the way that they interpreted it was fairies were angels and demons, or demigods. Essentially, they would say, "Oh, well, these things that you've been worshiping, those were actually fallen angels. Those were actually, or they were just straight up demons."
Yes.
So they were.
That's one of the most interesting parts of anything from the 16th to the I think even into the 19th century, where just people are adapting every sort of religion from around the world to make it conform to a Christian idea of what things should be.
And so that's where we get things like, name magic, which is a very important thing in Stardust. One of the things, the way that you can control a fairy is if you know their name. We see that in Rumpelstiltskin, right?
Yes.
It's only once she's able to learn his name that she can master him. And by the same token, if a fairy buys your name or steals your name, they have you in their power. And that's where we get the idea of a Christian name, of christening, is if a child didn't have a God-given Christian name, well, they were a blank slate and a fairy could steal them.
Really? That's an interesting one.
And again, they were not the way that we think of them today. They were impish demons, essentially. And that was, again, because of it was a recontextualization by, Christianity in the Celtic and Nordic and Scandinavian worlds. They were trying to recontextualize these existing gods as demons within their own understanding of angels and fallen angels. It's really, really wild.
And particularly, just going back to Neil Gaiman's work on mythology, it's interesting you bring up all that sort of era, because there's only really two documents that tell us about Norse gods at this point.
Yeah.
One of them is the Poetica, and I can't remember what the other one's called, but they were only sort of allowed to exist for the purpose of converting local meaning into Christian terminology.
Okay, interesting.
So they were like, well, everyone knows about Odin, so we have to write these documents that tell us about Odin so we can use these various things to convert the locals.
Sure.
And in the Norse mythologies, as according to Neil Gaiman,
Yeah.
he tries to remove a lot of that from
Okay,
his
fascinating.
sort of work. So he says, well, I don't know if any of this is actually true, and it doesn't actually matter to him, and it probably shouldn't matter to anyone really reading the thing. But he tries to tell the stories in a way that they would have been told before Christianity came to the region, which gives you a much... It feels more authentic. Obviously, it's completely inauthentic because we have no idea what they would have been like.
Right.
But it gives you a strange and compelling reason to read on from this apparent sort of a perspective of an author who knew what things were really like.
Yeah, it's almost like he's boiling it down to what he imagines its original state was, and we do see that in Stardust, like we were just saying a moment ago, treating fairies as they were. Again, it's funny because we say traditionally, but that's not how they were traditionally. It was really this recontextualization of the existing lore of the Celtic peoples, or the Nordic peoples, in such a way that it was congruent with Christianity. We could explain it as, oh, well, these gods that you had, and well, they're just really demons, and we call them the fair folk.
Yeah, and obviously not everything is a religious kind of text with him.
No.
We have Neverwhere, I think, is... I mean, it's not completely devoid of religion and mythology and such things, but it's more about a sort of here and now, but there's also a magical world attached to everything.
Right.
And I don't know, have you read Neverwhere?
I'll be honest, that's one that I haven't gotten to yet.
Okay.
Would you mind filling me in on it a little bit?
Well, I don't know how much I can do that. So I've only read half of it. And
Sure.
I'll tell you why. It starts off quite well, but it's one of his earlier works, and I don't think it's necessarily the best written out of any of his books. And it's a sort of slow burn. You've got the sort of corporate man going to London, starting a new life sort of thing. And gradually...
Okay, I remember this. I have read this one. I'm sorry.
Right, yeah. Gradually magical elements start sort of appearing around him, and he sort of starts going a bit mad, I think, when he encounters, people on the street who aren't what they appear to be, and no one else seems to be noticing them except for him. Gradually over time, and he's got this very annoying girlfriend who, I don't know, just doesn't want to notice the sort of unreality of the world around her, and sort of sticks to this mundane perspective of reality. And yes, I think it's really more like a metaphor about homelessness in London, but from a perspective of magic and fairy nature of the world. And there's sort of trolls and goblins and things that pop up every now and then.
Yeah, so I have, I don't know why, for some reason, the names of some of his books kind of run together for me, so that's why I didn't immediately jump at that. But I did finish this one recently, and believe it or not, he does incorporate religion very heavily towards the end of it.
All right. Okay.
It turns out, I won't give spoilers, but an angel who was meant to be guarding Atlantis. What's his name? He has a very funny name. Oh, the angel Islington.
Right. Great.
Of course. So the angel Islington was meant to be guarding Atlantis and protecting it, but the reason why it's lost to this world is because he failed. And so his punishment is that he now rules London Below, which is this place that the people like the homeless and the mentally ill in London fall through the cracks, and they enter this world where, magic is real, and it just happens to be in the underground of London. And you're absolutely right in the allegory, identifying the allegory he was trying to do. I mean, he states very explicitly it was meant to be a commentary on homelessness and mental illness and our attitudes towards that in the West and specifically in London. And I think that's why, so that was, I think that was his first book. And it actually didn't begin life as a book. It began as a miniseries, a BBC miniseries. And he later decided to go back and adapt it, adapt the script to be a novel. But essentially, the reason why it has a bit of a meandering feel to it is because all the things that the network made him cut out, because they're like, well, this isn't relevant to the story. I understand you like it, but it's just simply not advancing the plot or developing the characters. He put all that stuff back in. So it's sort of a, thumbing his nose at them.
Yeah, there seems to be an awful lot of that in his writing as well. Just to go off on a bit of a tangent,
Sure.
you can go to a bookstore today and pick up the preferred text copies of 10 Neil Gaiman books.
Yes.
Where he's come back with all of his additional notes, adding 100 pages to things. So I read his American Gods version of that, and it does feel a bit long in places,
right?
But he's got his way with his books, it seems.
Well, he has enough literary sway. He has enough celebrity now that he can do that. And he's not the only one. Stephen King does that kind of thing fairly often himself. He will go back and re-edit his books and put stuff back in. Or, if you look at some of his later works, you can tell that, he's got enough clout that when he tells the editors to back off, they back off. And so there's things that make it in that maybe aren't necessary to the story. I think they actually just recently released a version of American Gods that is the author's preferred text plus annotations. So the original book was about 500 or 600 pages. I think the preferred text is closer to 900 pages.
That seems about right, yes, yeah.
This version is something like 1,200 pages.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's quite a bit bigger. And it's essentially, not only has he included everything in the kitchen sink, now he's giving you his thought processes about why and, where did this come from and why did he do it this way?
Which could be really useful for writers if anyone wants to know the exact process of his way of going about things and how he actually wrote American Gods.
Absolutely.
And I think just to talk about his writing and his writing process is very, very important because he's not a traditional sit down and just hammer out a book kind of person.
No.
He says he has a lot of trouble writing, and so he's developed a number of interesting ways to get around that.
Yeah.
And they're all very analog. So he doesn't write on a computer, I believe, at all.
Right. He uses a pen, doesn't he?
Uses a fountain pen. He has 3 or 4 different color ones as well.
Oh wow!
So he has a writing desk in a part of his house that has no connection to the internet. Doesn't have a radio, doesn't have a television. His children are not allowed to come and disturb him while he's sitting there. And so he says he does that because the only thing he can do in that space is nothing or write. Right. And so if you have the choice between nothing and writing is always the more enjoyable activity. And you're setting aside a few hours a day just to do that. He gets an awful lot of writing done.
Absolutely.
Although I assume it's a nightmare to then transcribe uh,
Oh my
everything
goodness.
into the computer after that.
Yeah, oh, I can only imagine. And he actually does, not only does he create those extremely limiting conditions, at the moment of writing, he does what he calls composting. So essentially what he does is he keeps a notebook or three on
Right.
him at all times, and he has his little fountain pen. And so, for instance, the Graveyard book,
Yeah.
that one took him about 10 years to actually sit down and write. And the reason why was because he had the idea when he was in his mid-20s. I think he was about 25. And he started writing it, and he got the sense that the world building was off. He wasn't able to create this world of the cemetery where ghosts have this society in a way that felt convincing, because he said, frankly, I just didn't feel like I had visited enough cemeteries around the world. And so what he did was he put that in the compost pile. He knew he would return to it, but he needed to let it break down, and he needed to gather more resources over time. And so when he was on book tours, or just traveling in general, everywhere he went, he would visit the local graveyard and he would take notes. He did that for 10 years. And then I assume he finally got to the point where he was, ready to sit down. So he put himself in that little deprivation chamber of a room.
Yes. Yeah.
But even more, going further back than that, he wrote from a very young age, from his teens. But he talked about how he said, if you went up in my attic right now, you would find tubs filled with the first 1 to 3 pages of stories that I've abandoned. And he said that the moment that he became a real writer was I can't remember who it was he spoke to, but it was another famous writer. I want to say it was Robert Heinlein. But he spoke to some American sci-fi author and said, how do I get better? And the guy gave him what he thought was a very glib response at first, but he thinks is actually quite wise now, and it's one of his rules as a writer for himself. Is he says, you start writing and you finish writing. And so it was only once he actually began finishing stories that he said he really felt like he came into his own, that he began to be able to identify his own voice and grow enough as a writer that he could get his work published. But his problem was he kept starting and stopping and putting away, and starting and stopping and putting away, because, an idea is so much more attractive than the 3 pages of dreck you have in front of you.
Yes. I mean, I'm sure this is a common problem for most people who want to be an author.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know I'm guilty of it. I'm sure you are as well. But
Yes.
I want to say it's a very actually effective method, though. I tried it for, I think, 6 months last year.
Oh, wow.
And I did end up with a couple of books as a result.
Oh, wow.
I mean, nothing came of them, but in terms of actually being able to write, it's super effective. I'd recommend anyone try it who's having trouble motivating themselves. Just to get a story out.
Well, and even for writers who do have that natural drive, it's still worth doing. Like you said, you wrote 2 or 3 books in that time. It doesn't matter if nothing comes of those. So Brandon Sanderson, famous fantasy writer, sci-fi and fantasy writer right now, probably one of the most famous. He talks about how he wrote 12 novels during his master's in writing.
That's insane.
Never see it. They'll never see, and they're massive. Knowing him, they're probably 1,000-page novels.
Yeah.
And he says they'll never see the light of day. They are unworkable. They are unable to be fixed. And people say, "Oh, that's awful. You know, you wasted all that time writing these novels." He says, "Absolutely not. If I hadn't written the first 12, I couldn't have written the 13th." And I think that, you know, that's why it is valuable. You know, no time spent writing is time wasted.
No, certainly not.
That is time advancing down the path. So for even for somebody who doesn't really have a hard time with writing, you know, giving yourself that deprivation chamber. I mean, who knows? You could churn out even more, you know, works than that, and get closer and closer to that novel or collection that really takes off.
I think it's certainly something for people to consider. Although if you are going to write like him with a physical pen in a notebook, I just have to warn you that you should have good handwriting, or at least the ability to read your own handwriting. And it will be a nightmare to transcribe everything thereafter.
Yes.
Probably easier just to rewrite the book on a computer at that point.
Yes.
But yes, I think we should move on to our next section.
Okay.
And I think we want to talk about sort of the critical response to Neil Gaiman and his general popularity and what sort of genres he occupies. So I would like to say that I don't think he's actually hugely popular in terms of book sales. And I say this solely off the information of logging on to my Kindle and looking for his most popular book. And that actually being a commentary on Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, non-fiction work. Followed, I believe, by American Gods, which is probably on the heels of the television series as well. And I think he is a smaller author in terms of sales, but where he's really succeeded has been his adaptations in movies and television series. I think people are very familiar with a lot of those programs, such as American Gods. Lucifer is based on characters by him, I believe. The current, I think it's a Netflix series.
I think it's based on his Lucifer from the Sandman series.
Yes, yeah. So it's based off a character from the Sandman series, which other people helped write as well. It's not exclusively him. Good Omens, he co-authored with Terry Pratchett. Although I think Terry Pratchett is by far the bigger name in regard to that partnership. What else has he? Stardust as well did very well as a movie. I think it's maybe not a big blockbuster, but it certainly has a loyal cult following. And I think that's where people come at Neil Gaiman from, either that or via his comic book series.
Okay, so you're thinking it's more his adaptations into sometimes more popular, sometimes less popular media. Less popular being comics, that he is introduced to most readers. Like they don't find him necessarily from the work proper, but from some adaptation of it, and then that's how they get to his fiction.
Yeah, I think although when Sandman came out, comics sold a lot better than they do today. But obviously today comic books don't generate any sort of traction, unfortunately.
That's a good note to make, because when they were coming out, that was sort of I believe it was a golden age of comics.
It certainly wasn't today. The pre-internet era really drove a lot of pop fiction and pulp media into people's hands because they needed something to occupy their time, I suppose.
Yeah.
When you couldn't just log on to some sort of social media. And yeah, he was never super popular, but I think he was always well known in the indie kind of comic scene. And I think he bled over into the Marvel universe. Am I wrong? No, the DC universe.
The DC universe, yeah.
And if you really sort of want to see that sort of influential kind of era, you should have a look at some of the adaptations of, I think, Constantine is something that came from the Sandman series as well. We've got Lucifer as well. There's a few very well known characters that sort of just become quite well known on TV or in the movie universe.
Yeah. So they sort of spun off.
And it's sort of from his sort of idea that they sprung off from. So I think he's good at creating an initial concept at the very least. That's interesting.
Yeah. So you think that essentially he does a good job of seeding an idea.
To give another example, just when he wrote Good Omens with Terry Pratchett, he initially just sent him, I think, 3,000 or 4,000 words of an idea he had, and he sent it to him, and 2 years later, Terry Pratchett wrote back to him and said, "I'd like to buy this from you if you're not going to do anything with it."
Oh wow!
And either that or we write it together. And obviously, he said, "Well, I can't not write something with Terry Pratchett."
Right.
So I'm gonna set aside the hours of 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. in the morning and hammer out my version of the book.
So it sounds like you're saying where he shines best, where he is most productive, is almost in a collaborative setting, in almost the function of a showrunner in television, in Hollywood, where so for instance, the way that I'm most familiar with how writers' rooms work is Dan Harmon, who created Community and Rick and Morty. Yeah. So the way that a writer's room works is you have the showrunner who comes up with the characters, the world, the concepts, and all this sort of stuff. And then they have writers, 10 to 12 writers max, who pitch premises for these. And then from that, they're able to create a story. So it's not actually it's very rarely that the showrunner is actually the one writing the stories proper, but they're the one who sign off on the concept and the premise. They're the ones who go back and edit and revise the story to their liking. And it seems like, from what I've read of, and especially what I've learned from the masterclass he was talking about with, writing comics, that's absolutely the way he does it. Because he does have to, the drawing is that's not his part of the game. He has to leave that up to them as far as, how the plotting actually works out frame by frame. And even though he may not be doing that as a showrunner proper in things like Good Omens, although I think he may be a showrunner in that.
He was the showrunner, and I think he was the executive producer as well. So
gotcha.
He had a lot of control over that one.
So it sounds like that. Are you tracking with kind of the thought process?
I am not sure if I entirely agree with everything there. I think it's almost the opposite for him, where he's probably leading the writers' room because he's quite a well-known author. But I think he's the guy pitching the idea, if you know what I mean.
Okay.
And then people will come in with maybe improvements.
Okay.
Which is why I think Good Omens works so well.
Yes.
Is that initially a sort of his idea, and then improved or accentuated by sort of Terry Pratchett's writing style.
Gotcha.
Thereafter. And I think Sandman is a similar process as well, where Neil Gaiman comes up with these various concepts. And then he sits in a room with, I think, 2 other people were involved in that. Obviously the draftsman, and there was someone else I can't remember. And then they sort of hammer out the details of a story, and I think it comes together quite well in most of those examples. But then when he's left by himself, I'm less convinced he comes up with a tight, well-structured story. I think it
Sure.
tends to be a little bit more rambling
Yes.
in those circumstances.
So you think that he needs the where he shines the best is where he has someone who is he's able to bounce ideas off of, who's able to help refine it down to its essence, and have a more functionalist perspective of nothing missing, nothing excessive.
I also think he might be quite good at doing that by himself
Okay,
if he knows that's what he's going for.
gotcha.
I think with Stardust, he set out to write a short, children's fairy tale.
Right.
And with Coraline, he did a short children's horror, I suppose.
Right.
And they both came out pretty well.
Mhm.
There's not too much additional
Material, yeah.
material there, and very easy to read. Doesn't bore you at any point. But then when he's not intentionally trying to write any specific kind of thing,
Yeah.
I think there are a few issues that pop up, and maybe
Okay.
we can talk about these quibbles.
Sure. Do you want to jump onto that?
Sure.
Next?
I think American Gods comes to the forefront when I think of things
Sure.
that maybe are not great with his writing, and it is basically just a length problem, I think, at that
Right.
point. Although not entirely. I think because he wrote it over, I think 5 years, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was over a considerable period of time.
Where he was on tour and on the road, I think mostly in America, obviously, during that time,
Yes.
promoting other books or working on TV shows or doing other projects. That he had the sort of loose idea that there was some kind of book that could be written about this experience.
Yeah.
And, being Neil Gaiman, he incorporated, Norse mythology and other religious mythology into it along the way.
Mhm.
With a bit of magic thrown in just for good measure.
Absolutely.
And what to me, it just suffers for sort of not having like a very specific goal in mind.
Right.
Where I'm not sure if it's about the antagonists, Odin and
Right.
Loki and all those other people, or is it about a social message about slavery, because that pops up in that as well. Is it about like the personal journey of the main character,
Right.
and his sort of growth? Why is the wife character even in it, really?
Yeah.
Is something I've never quite.
Oh, I can tell you
figured out.
exactly why she's in it.
Okay.
She is the Deus Ex Machina. Because essentially, it's fascinating. I noticed this because I had that same frustrating question. I was like, why is she even in this at all? And actually, it's fascinating if you listen to Neil Gaiman talking about it. She's the catalyst for the whole story, which I find very odd. So essentially, for those who haven't read the story, just to get a general
Good idea. Yeah.
summary synopsis. So essentially, there's a man named Shadow who's in jail, and he was in jail for having beaten up a business partner. And he served his time. He's getting out. He's excited to see his wife. He's made a friend while he was in there with a guy who goes by Low Key Locksmith, LOW -KEY. We'll let you guess who that actually is. And
Yeah, he gets let out a couple of days early because his wife's died.
Yes.
In the meantime.
His wife has died while carrying on an affair with the same guy, I believe the business partner who he beat up. I may not have the details quite right there. The important thing to know is he beat somebody up. And that's why he went to jail. But she was carrying on this affair while he was in jail. And he runs into a guy named Mr. Wednesday. just seemingly out of the blue. And the guy says, "Hey, Shadow, you're a big tough guy. I want to hire you as a bodyguard." And from there on in the book, he's just kind of at Wednesday's beck and call. He does whatever Wednesday tells him to do. He goes where he wants to go. We don't have much interiority. We don't get into Shadow's head all that often. We don't have any sense of why he's doing what he's doing. He has no ultimate goal. He's just floating along through life because he's so devastated that his wife died while cheating on him, actually. And in the meantime, his wife has started, she's become undead. And I won't go into how that came about, the mechanism behind that, but she begins following him around the country and showing up at random times. But essentially, he will get into a sticky situation because he's doing whatever Mr. Wednesday has told him to do as they're traveling the United States. And then she shows up and she gets him out. She always knows, she can basically sense when he's in trouble, and she now has these godlike powers, and she'll show up and she'll kill everybody who's, trying to hurt him, or she'll break him out of his chains, and she'll, she is the Deus Ex Machina for the story. And literally, I counted all the different situations that he gets himself into where it's these climactic moments of, oh no, how is he going to get out? And inevitably, every single time she shows up and she gets him out of it without any fuss. So I would say from what I've learned from listening to Gaiman talk about it, he says this is a story about a guy grieving the death of his wife and essentially trying to come to terms with their relationship. However, functionally within the story, she is a plot device. She doesn't, we don't really get much into her inner world. She's actually quite almost cruel with the way that she talks about her affair. I mean, she gives him all the gory details of her affair with this other guy. She's very unapologetic about it. She never seems to really care one way or another. She sees it as she's like, oh, well, I was, you weren't here, so I went to this guy, plain and simple. So it's fascinating because to him, she is the center of the story. But it sounds like to you and me, she feels almost tangential, like she could be cut out altogether.
It's interesting because she does always pop up, when he's about to die.
Yeah.
And prevents that. And then she gets dropped immediately from what seems to be the main storyline every single time.
Yep.
Only to pop right back up when needed.
Yeah. And that's why I would say she is reduced functionally to the role of a plot device. Whether or not, and I think it's because, there isn't really an end goal in mind. It's just, so there's oddly enough, a concept I learned from the writers of South Park. They said there's two, I know it's odd, but there's two ways to write a story. And they think that there's a preferred way and a way that's a little primitive. They said that the most primitive way to write a story is to have between each episode, between each narrative moment, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And to them, there's not really any causality. There's not, it's just different points strung together. Whereas their preferred way of writing is to, and because of that, so that it's more dominoes bumping into each other. And I think American Gods has a very and then quality to it, where there doesn't seem to be much causality between episodes, between narrative moments. You're just following him down this path and seeing what happens next without any sort of goal.
I mean, that's very interesting because it does seem that there is an interesting narrative in that story, and I
Yeah,
think that revolves
absolutely.
around Wednesday and his sort of like plan to bring Ragnarok upon the gods
Right, right.
of the world,
But we don't.
which happens and is interesting, and there's a lot of drama around it, and then the book carries on
Yeah,
for a considerable amount of time after that, uh, resolving tangential issues that happened along the way,
yeah,
and it kind of peters out.
yeah. It was very strange. That climactic moment. I remember I was actually a little dissatisfied. I won't give it away, but essentially the solution is just Shadow showing up and telling people some information, and they all just kind of go, "Oh, okay." And they all go their separate ways. And I found that very anticlimactic, um, very disappointing. And you're right. From there, he just kind of, we have another 200, or I think closer to 300 pages in the version that I read of it, where we're just tying up loose ends from other subplots. And then even after that, we have an epilogue that is just another little meandering tangent of, oh well, let's see if there's another incarnation of Odin somewhere else.
Yes, yeah, that was a particularly strange one, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And
Uh,
yeah, this there was. Does this person have anything to do with the Odin we knew in the main story? No, not at all.
yeah.
But
So
yeah,
it is fascinating. Do you have any other like quibbles specific to that
I
story?
just thought the character of Shadow wasn't um, didn't feel real
Yeah.
most of the time. He didn't react in any way I would attribute to a normal human reacting
Right.
to things, which they sort of imply that he's half god. I think. Um,
So spoilers for anybody who wants to skip like the next 2-3 seconds of this. Starting now, it's hinted that he is Balder, who is, I believe, the youngest son of Odin.
yeah,
Uh, they never come out and say that. That's one thing that, but Gaiman has confirmed that in interviews. It is meant to be Balder. Um, and yeah, he doesn't have, he's not a very dimensional character. You're right. Because as I understand it, the three dimensions, when we talk about a three-dimensional character, um, we're talking about who that person thinks they are, what other people think that they are, and then what they actually do at under moments of duress or when nobody else is watching. So I guess we could call that, who they really are. And we
and
don't really get
yeah,
that.
he doesn't act during those moments. He mostly just
No,
does nothing.
right.
He doesn't really think,
No.
or we don't see his thought process on things.
Mm-mm.
So it always seems he's doing something for no reason.
Right.
He does something, or he's being told to do something, or he's just accompanying Wednesday / Odin along his journey.
Yeah. He's sort of an empty vessel. He's kind of like the silent protagonist in a video game. He's this hollow vessel that the character or the player character can pour themselves into and use as a vehicle to explore the world.
Yeah, but I mean, but in that regard, you might be thinking, oh, he's not like a Master Chief sort of character. He doesn't actually do any action really. I mean, there are a few things that happen, and he is always portrayed as like sort of like a bruiser type character, I suppose.
Yeah.
But he's not particularly violent, and he doesn't particularly care about what he's doing most of the time.
No. He doesn't have any stake in the game. He doesn't have any. There's not really anything that he has left to lose. So there aren't many. There's not many stakes for him, and certainly not very many high stakes. It's just sort of he's told to do something and he does it. And if things don't go his way, oh well, he's just going to accept his fate. And then his wife shows up and saves him.
Now,
sorry.
so we've talked about American Gods quite a lot. I wonder if there's any other work of his you think that this applies to, or that you have a different problem with.
I mean, I think that this is actually a pretty common problem in his, which is the unmotivated character, or the plot which follows the and then structure. There's very rarely that the character has an overarching plot goal that they're moving towards. They simply adapt to and react to whatever happens to them. So they're very rarely autonomous. They're very rarely the ones driving the plot. They are subjects of the plot. They are victims of it, rather. It just feels to me like a lot of the times people are being dragged along. And yes, they see these fantastic worlds and characters and scenarios, but I think it's very rare that they are the ones who create the conditions for those things to happen by their actions. I think they're kind of dragged along. And I think that a lot of that comes back to Neil Gaiman's perspective on writing, which, one of the things that he says is he doesn't believe in leaving anything out. He, as the author, and we've kind of touched on that already, but if he wants to include something, he's going to include it. And so much so that he uses a kind of antiquated way of introducing his characters, or I've always seen it as antiquated, where he gives the character elevator eyes, especially if they're a female character, where we describe their hair and we describe their eyes, their nose and their mouth, talk about their figure, and any other notable features about them. And that's with the introduction of every single character.
Now that you mention it, yeah, that does seem very Neil Gaiman.
Yeah, he's very happy to, as he says, pause the story to describe the setting, to describe the character, and even within the dialogue of his stories, there's very rarely a genuine conflict between the characters. It's not that they are at cross purposes to one another. It's not that they're fighting for something that is if one has, the other can't have it. It's most often people philosophizing. And so to me, a lot of his work does have this feel of, it's almost like going through a museum, and you go to a different exhibit and you see these characters, usually characters from folklore or mythology, and they have this really fascinating conversation about, life and living, some sort of philosophical or ideological concept, and then they move on to the next exhibit.
That's wonderful, because he himself says the only thing you get from going to museums is sore feet. but that's very interesting. But I think that might be a draw for some people who sort of view it in a more literary sense, where it's just a compilation of artworks. He describes an exhibit. He sets a scenario, and then he lets it play out.
Yeah. And I think that one of the chief pleasures that his readers get is, I can't remember where I heard this quote, but there's a great quote that says, bad writing makes the reader feel like a dunce. Great writing makes them feel like a genius. And I think that is one of the chief pleasures that he has to offer, is not just, the wonder or the fantasy of the fantastic elements of his stories, the premises or the concepts. I think it's mostly the feeling like you are on the inside. I think he appeals to people who are already interested in things like religion or folklore or mythology, and so he is telling these inside jokes, and people can kind of all if this was to be literalized, they'd all be sitting in a circle, giving each other eyes, side eyeing each other and nodding their heads as he's talking.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. There's a lot of that in literary fiction, which we
Yes.
often don't think is good writing. But I just want to say it's not like we're saying there's nothing good about his writing style.
No.
And I certainly didn't have to read all of American Gods, yet I got through it in a reasonable amount of time. I mean, it did take a while. And his other works have been entertaining.
Absolutely.
There's definitely something to the way he puts words together.
Yeah.
And I would encourage anyone who doesn't like the way he writes to sit down and just listen to him speak for a while.
Yeah.
Because he has a quality to his voice which is just fascinating, and fascinating in the sense of the word that he might describe it as, where one is fascinated by something and cannot help but look directly at it for the entire duration of the speech.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what he's talking about, really. He just has a good quality, almost a sort of a magical quality, really, to his voice. And that just entrances a person and makes them want to continue with it. And if you are into that, and you are the kind of person who has an internal narrator when they read, you'll get that in his books, and that can be a very enjoyable experience in itself.
Absolutely. Essentially, if you are the sort of person who is like you said, you have that internal voice, if you are fascinated by these subjects that are they're archetypal in the human experience, mythology, religion, folklore, and you're somewhat familiar with those already. That's the only thing I will say is, I grew up, my mother was a elementary school teacher, and she sort of specialized in, we went to a strange classical school is what it was called. She specialized in Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and a little bit of Nordic mythology. That's what she taught. And so and obviously fairy tales figured in there as well. So I was inundated with that stuff from the time I was, 5 years old on. And so I've kind of internalized a lot of that. And I remember reading American Gods and being like, oh, this is Ibis, or this is, I was figuring out who these different characters were, or what they were referencing in the original stories that they came from. But I remember pausing and going, hang on, if I didn't know that, I would be utterly lost right now.
No, I agree, especially with, you're talking about the Funeral Parlor Brothers.
Yes.
And it makes no sense if you have no concept of Egyptian mythology. But it makes you feel smart if you do.
Exactly. Precisely. And I don't think he is intentionally trying to lock people out. I think he is trying to welcome people like him in, but the risk is, because he is so cryptic and arcane in a lot of the things that he does bring up, and the fact that he's not interested in making it clear for those who aren't initiates, it can feel a little alienating and isolating if you're not familiar with those things. And even, like I said, even as somebody who is deeply and intimately familiar with a lot of the characters and the concepts and the stories he's talking about, I found myself being a little annoyed for the person who wasn't.
That's certainly a big problem with that, is you will alienate a substantial portion of your audience
Right.
by doing that.
And maybe that explains...
if you look at a more popular writer, someone like Stephen King,
Mm-hmm.
they don't do that very often.
No.
And so some of his works certainly has, I mean, it isn't, sorry, is that the right one? It.
Yeah.
Clown thing? Yeah. That's not for everyone.
No.
I think the movies are for everyone, and they've condensed it really well into that. But the book itself is weird and inaccessible. But the majority of his writing is just so easy to read, and that's and understand, more importantly. That's why he's such a popular writer.
I think
such a profitable writer as well, I imagine.
Yeah, you don't have to have studied, you don't have to have formally studied a subject in order to understand him. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily true for Neil Gaiman. You need to be somewhat familiar with fairy tales and folklore and mythology. But with Stephen King, just about anybody can approach his works, and the world that he's building it right in front of you, so you know as much as he does, you know. You're learning it along with him. So there's never the sense that there's anything being withheld or
you're like, well, okay, this is a story about a demon car. You don't have to know, the origins of it in Greek mythology or anything like that. It's just what it is. I think let's end off this discussion of Neil Gaiman with maybe what we think writers can learn from him.
I have one thing that I absolutely adored from his masterclass. He talked about how, and I can absolutely see this in his work, so I would call him a fabulist. And a fabulist is someone who works within traditional story forms. And
from the term fable, or?
Yes, from the term fable, exactly.
Right.
So the different traditional story forms would be, fables, allegories, myths, legends, fairy tales, folklore. So these are all story forms prior to the written word. Now some of them were later written down, but they were all originally part of the oral tradition. And because of just where they were coming from, they were oftentimes imbued with magic. The idea of a realistic story is very, very recent. Realism is the new kid on the block. But so he draws from this fabulous tradition, this traditional storytelling, which eventually bore, what we think of as fantasy and science fiction and supernatural horror. Those are all modern incarnations of traditional fiction, traditional stories. But as I understand it, there's two main forms. There's an allusive, ALLUSIVE type of fabulism, and then there is a structural fabulism. And structural fabulism is where you're actually framing it like a fairy tale, once upon a time and every day, and because of that, until one day, so on.
Whereas the other one would be a sort of allegory or something like that?
I think so. The elusive one is more reframing and reclaiming existing narratives. And I think that's what he focuses on. He does use a little bit of the fairy tale voice, but I don't know if he uses this fairy tale structure, because again, the fairy tale structure is very, very causal. It's those dominoes are being knocked over one by one, whereas he is much more meandering. But he has this elusive fabulism style, and one of the ways that he explained it brilliantly, I don't know if this is a story that he wrote or if it was just one he was throwing out there in his class, is he takes familiar stories that, as he puts it, belongs to the world. They're part of the world tradition. So that could be, Aladdin, or that could be the Odyssey, or Snow White. And he reads them as if he's read them it's his first time reading them. and he takes everything as literally as he possibly can. So with Snow White, he did that, and he thought about, okay, if I was to describe this story literally, there is a young dead woman in a glass coffin, and there is a man who is in love with her, and a queen who wants to keep him from getting to her. And he said, what does that sound like? Well, that sounds like there is a undead vampire, necrophile prince. And actually, in that version of the story, the queen is the hero. She's trying to prevent this horrible union of two quite perverted minds. The necrophile prince and the vampire queen, the vampire princess. And so just by doing that, he doesn't even have to say Snow White. He doesn't have to make reference to the dwarves. He can just take that concept and run with it. And now he's got a fresh story. And you may not even ever recognize that, oh, this is just a retelling of Snow White.
So yeah, and just in saying that, was the illusion in the genie character, the Jinn character in American Gods, supposed to be Aladdin, do you think?
Good question. I had not thought about that. You may be exactly right. Because are you talking about the down on his luck?
The cabbie, yeah.
Yeah, the cabbie, yeah. You might be exactly right.
He's literally a street rat. He's on the street.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that could be it. It's anyway, so he would be reframing the story of, and he actually has written another a genie story that he made reference in the masterclass, where he said, okay, well, let's just, rather than starting from an existing story, let's take an existing concept. So what is a genie's purpose? It's to give somebody whatever they want. Well, what would be a good way to throw a wrench in that? Have the person that releases the genie be somebody who's already satisfied. Well, what happens then? And in his iteration, the genie falls in love with her because she already has everything, and she just wants his companionship. And at the end of the story, she says, well, what would you wish for? And it ends with him saying, for the life of me, I can't think of anything. And I think that's a brilliant, I think he honestly shines in short fiction because.
No, I really like that story. And I think it is one of the better ones as well. It just sort of made me want to write a bunch of sort of short stories as well.
Exactly.
It does sometimes feel that a lot of his work is just a series of short fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like even in his novels, it's like it's a standalone episode, each chapter, and they tend to be very long chapters, usually between 20 and I think 40 pages long. So it feels like a series of short stories that have been strung together, which can give it a sort of stop and start quality, which, depending on your taste, that can be good or bad. So I guess what I would say is I think the thing that I've taken away from him that I really admire is his ability and his technique in reframing and reclaiming the world's stories and recontextualizing them in a way that they feel fresh and interesting. But also just the fact that, he says that he thinks stories are ultimately, they are about teaching people, or at least sharing with people, what you think is true, capital T, true about life and living. He says we use lies, stories about people who never were, and places that never were, and events that never happened, to tell people something true about life and living well.
Yeah, and that's certainly attractive to a whole number of people. Mm-hmm. What I'd say is, what you can really learn as a writer from him is that you don't necessarily have to be good at everything.
Sure.
In a book.
Absolutely.
And I would say, if you're if you're sort of a blank slate as a writer, his approach is probably not going to get you results. And
No.
you should look at the normal ways of becoming a better writer rather than trying to emulate some of his style, because some of his style is just so much part of his personality that it won't be possible for you to ride on any of that. But if you are like him and you have this unique tone, this voice and way of writing that is entrancing, you can get away with not having structure in your book.
Yeah.
You can get away with not really having realistic characters or plot points that, resolve themselves satisfactorily. And there's still going to be a publisher willing to publish your book. I'm not saying this is a good thing, and please don't do this. Have both things if you can do that.
Yeah.
Which is why I think when he's collaborated with, like in Good Omens with Terry Pratchett, it had that very fast-paced, well thought out kind of Terry Pratchett mirroring things and having the story reach a satisfactory conclusion and having an end where it should end.
Right.
And it's maybe one of the better books either of them have ever written in that regard.
Yeah.
And if you could learn to be a disciplined writer who thinks out their story and rewrites it in places that need rewriting, rather than just expound on an idea you've had in a satisfying tone, you're almost guaranteed to be successful at that point.
Absolutely. I think you're dead on there. No, I think that's an extremely encouraging point, is to acknowledge that voice and fascinating concepts and premises and situations. I mean, that's what he's built his career on. And so it is, we don't have to be perfect on every point. And in fact, there's no way we can be perfect on every point as a writer. I mean, I think anyone could make a compelling, or just about any writer or someone interested in literature could make a compelling point critiquing or analyzing any famous author. They can find something to quibble about that is valid. But it's oftentimes how much more potent those other elements are that outweighs that one quibble that really carries them along. And so I think you're right. It's best to avail ourselves of all the tools at our disposal, but to acknowledge that some are going to be much stronger. We're going to be much stronger with some over others. And, that can be enough to carry us through. But why not avail ourselves of all the different things at our disposal?
And on not being perfect, I think that will conclude our discussion for today.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to thank everyone for listening to the first Writers Talk podcast. If you like this podcast, please like and subscribe on YouTube, or leave a comment on the Writers Write website. Thank you for listening to the Writers Write podcast. You can find me or Oliver at writerswrite.co.za, or you can follow me at Christopher Luke Dean on Twitter. Thank you very much.